Welcome everyone to another session of Draw Along Sketching on Architecture, UNESCO Sites, Global Architecture on Viking.TV. Today we're going to draw Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom. The official name is the Hagia Sophia Grand Mosque in Istanbul. It's got a very interesting base to it. It's got an enormous scale and size, which is rarely met by other structures in the world. But we'll see where it came from. We see where it's been changed over time between two major religions. And in the course of an hour, we'll draw it together. Some of you may have already been drawing with me a while. If you're just starting, you might want to check the Viking.TV subset of a small piece on perspective, so you get the mechanics down first before we employ them here. I'll kind of review them really quickly here in terms of the three major principles that I teach with. And then we'll employ those ideas of the horizon line, the vanishing point, and value to make a three-dimensional object, in this case, the Hagia Sophia here in model form, be collapsed onto a two-dimensional sheet of paper. So we lose one dimension, but we still appear to be three-dimensional when we're done. So we're going to be working with the Hagia Sophia to make it three-dimensional and use those aspects of drawing which were basically formulated in the ancients and then moved toward the Renaissance and sort of reestablished at that point of view and became part of all drawing culture since. So if you're new to perspective, please follow those steps on the preliminary file first in perspective of Viking.TV, and then quickly join us again here so we can continue on in three-dimensional space together. So before we get to the actual subject here, I want to talk about the base sheet as well, because what helps us to draw as a team here is rather than give you a blank sheet, and as you follow me, try to size it appropriately on the paper. I'm going to give you a base drawing that looks like this. Hopefully you've printed that out already with the instructions on Viking.TV. 11 by 17 is sort of more appropriate because then you can work a bigger scale, maybe reduce it down and collapse your detail. 8.5 by 11 is fine too. So what we do then is give you a preliminary sort of pre-sketch that has tick marks of overall size of where the drawing is going to go and scale, and then we'll employ the idea of perspective to bring all the detail into it. So this base sheet then is ready for all the aspects we do with Viking.TV draw along sessions. Now, because we have 60 minutes together, we're going to do a sketch. That's about the time limit that's typical between a doodle of an idea over here in a matter of seconds. Once you spend minutes, 5, 10, 15, 20, up to an hour, it's called a sketch. If you want to draw it and have more of a formal drawing, then you work more sensitively with detail and design and aspects which are more specific to the building, and that takes hours. If you want to have a presentation drawing that's more like a rendering or a formal illustration, that could take 10 to 15 hours, sometimes even weeks. So we're going to commit to the sketch. The whole idea is we're going to bring the whole drawing out at once. It's going to sort of like open up and bleed up into us in a three-dimensional quality. We're going to do that out of the 3 points that are discussed in that earlier essay on perspective. So the first point here always is, what's our relationship to the object here? So in terms of how we view this, we're going to be looking up as humans as we approach the site up to the dome at the top of Hagia Sophia. So our horizon line is where our eyes are, so it's very low on the page because most of the subject is well above our eye height. So down here at the bottom, I pre-sketched in that horizon line, and to give us a reference of scale from where this photograph was taken we're going to draw from. We're not actually on the site of Hagia Sophia. We're in Istanbul, kind of looking from several blocks away, but our eye height is right at the base of this photograph down here. And so if you put a person on there, they would have their head and their torso, because the eyes have to be on the horizon line, then their legs in proportion to the torso, and then their feet on the earth. So somebody a lot closer to us in terms of the view shift for this, and further away from that, we're also in this foreground. They have become larger, the torso larger, and now the feet and legs don't even fit on the page. I'm off the paper, but you can see I created a sense of distance and scale with that movement of the heads along the horizon line. So we'll add people when we're done with the sketch as well as part of our foreground, because obviously it's a very populated city. There's always tourists, people on their way to prayer at the Hagia Sophia, so it's a very busy site. So with that in mind, that's our first key aspect in terms of locating how you're drawing it based on where your eyes are relative to the subject. So basically, most of the content is above us. What happens then, and this is how we use architecture, and this formal quality of being really orthogonal most of the way, and we're going to exercise an impressive dome within our orthogonal quality. But basically what sets this whole up is a central box. and we have a primary corner that's closer to us. You see in the photograph, that corner is right about there. And then the edge of the box is over here on the right, and the second edge is back here to the left. Now, because it's well above the horizon line, that parallel line, because it's parallel, is meant to be a flat line forever. And it's parallel to something at the bottom, and they will never meet in space. What perspective does, we eliminate the actual dimension here of 3 down to 2 by using vanishing points for those horizon lines. And most everybody has an exposure to this maybe in grammar school, and then unless you employ that in higher level education or professionally, you kind of lose sight of what those points do for us. So what we're going to do is simply go to the top of that box, and now rather than go straight across the page, because it is a horizontal line, it's going to cant down to a point that eventually will come down and meet the horizon line off the page to the right. So we have to remember that every horizontal line will either go to this point to the right, or now that we turn the corner and go to the left side of that cubic volume up there, that's going to rush back and go to a left vanishing point off the page over here. So every subset of a horizontal line is going to be parallel to those, but they're not going to be literally drawn parallel because they're all going to come down to a point this way, off the page there and off the page there. And that's what that earlier 10-minute essay that's posted on Viking.TV can actually explain to you in better detail. So that's point number 2, to always have a left and right vanishing point. RVP and LVP is somewhere down here, probably about 12 inches off my paper on both sides before it comes down and meets our HL horizon line. Now the next step for us then is going to be my selection for media. And Viking posted what I prefer you use in terms of a pencil stock, because pencil is an introductory way to study perspective and drawing. If you get a color pencil, and just in the black version of it, so a black color pencil, in this case I've got a mixture of Prismacolor brand, Blick Studio, you can find them in Crayola, Rose Art has them. But if you use that, it's a different type of value then across the spectrum of how we see. So if there is no light, and we cover up the lens of the camera right now, you would have 100% dark. If we do no drawing, we've got 0% dark, because it's all page white. We need to have the sketch move between those and have some aspect of all those percentages leading to some actually being as black as we can get, and then having the page show in some spectacle of very bright white areas. So we're going to control the sun and how it lights up our three-dimensional object, because with the sunlight, we see form. So our first steps are going to be sort of score out the massing of the building. And what will happen is we're going to use the language of this building from 537 in the Christian era, AD, where it's going to be emblematic of a split in the Christian world that happens in the early years of Christianity, where there is a Western version of it centered in Rome, and then there's an Eastern version centered in originally Byzantium, then Constantinople, and now Istanbul. So what we have here then is a type of structure that's trying to claim the East with a mounting on that square form of a very impressive dome. A one of a kind, it held like that in the Eastern world until it finally eclipsed with larger scale buildings. But it dominated in terms of the presence of the interior space globally. It's the largest church or religious building on the planet until the 1500s in Spain, when Seville actually built a larger cathedral. So up until then, we have a series of boxes now that are going to come down on the space here. After a certain level here, a certain height, you see these boxes are going to come down and support that. It turns the corner and then comes back this way. Lower toward the ground, we start to see some of the architecture of the neighboring buildings climb up the basin to the base of the promontory itself, and so we'll have lines that will stroke across here for our subset of architecture. When they come to a corner, they're going to return back to the left side. So if that's the edge of something, it'll return back to the left side. We're always going to keep that in mind. Now, what's tricky about the circle up above, and that's why I drew in that kind of arc for you, is that it's going to spin a circle around in 3 dimensions. So it's always feels like it's moving and rotating around, and our shading will help promote that. If you're trying to sketch by yourself on a blank piece of paper, you can realize that in the formation of a circle in plan, if you take a pure square and find 4 midpoints on its 4 sides, you then have an inscribed circle within that realm. And that's the language of structure here, where the architect engineers will create a succession of triangulation of massing and forms to support the thrust of the architecture pushing down on the dome itself. So with those key points, knowing that a circle can always be inscribed in a square, if you draw a square in perspective, for instance, the perspective may look like this in space to you, and you can find that because it's going to vanish to points. Then if you bisect that twice, you'll find 1 point, 2 point, 3 points, and 4. So now we've tipped this down on a flat basin, and now you can arc in a shallow arc, a very abrupt movement of it, the twin on this side and abrupt over here. So these two sides to the actual spherical base are identical, but they take a different turn like a fish hook, and these end up being more linear. So that allows you to, that perspective. What we'll see here at the top of our dome, we see this much of the dome which rises above our horizon line. So that's why when we come here, we want to draw not just the front of it, where we see the arc, we want to make sure we go to the edge of it and we actually turn the corner and come around just a little bit. And that's for the sake of making this thing, make sure it's three-dimensional and spins around that aspect to it. And that's very important for all domes that we structure there. Now, also part of this is that the biggest aspect of the history of Hagia Sophia from 537 on is that it was built as a Christian church, and eventually then in the 1500s, it's taken over by the Muslim world and converted to a mosque. And so all the iconography that was Christian came down because that's not appropriate in the Muslim faith, and now symbols and numeric things and scriptures can be posted on the inside. So it's the same experience formally in terms of the space, but it's different in terms of the actual iconography inside and outside the mosque at this time. So before we get too far, I want to talk about why the dome would be there, because again, this competition with the Western world is all based on the major dome from the antiquities, and that's in Rome proper with the Pantheon, which was done as a pantheon to the gods. And so the way it's based on there in terms of geometry and mathematics, much like we'll understand the geometry and mathematics of Hagia Sophia, is that within this circle itself, it'll be broken up to 8 quadrants. And 7 of those quadrants are on the interior, and they're all the architecture that frame the ceremonies of the Roman gods at the time, with an opening in the center, an oxygen in the center that lets in the natural light, the stars at night. So there are no artificial lights on the inside. It's just lit by the heavens above. The 8th portal is the entry where man enters through a Roman temple to front. So it's a cylinder in plan. It's a spectacle in dome. It was the largest dome in Christendom for the longest time until St. Peter's was built. And then the series of architecture that laid this was very aggressively futuristic in that the dome itself was self-sufficient. It resisted the outward force to push this way and have the building fail, because each tier here was integrally sophisticated enough to be self-sufficient. So the 5 tiers that are stacked up on here make a very static type of dome that sits on that perch, and that knowledge is passed down in generations and is employed the same way at the Hagia Sophia. And at the Hagia Sophia invents yet another type of dome on top of that in terms of structuring, which we'll talk about once we advance with the sketch. Okay, so again, our view shed is down here at the base. We're going to come up and see projecting wings here on all 4 sides. We'll see the 3 here. We won't see the one in the back. And then the advancement, eventually when it became a mosque, is to have the daily pairs through their mounted minarets. And they went up in pairs. There's now 4 standing there. And so we'll have a frontal view of the ones that are closest to us. The 2 in the front, the one off to the left, a little bit to the distance. And then one behind the dome barely puts its crown peak above the dome proper. And that'll create that relationship now between the Christian church and the merging of Muslim faith, and how that gets adopted into other types of Muslim mosques that we'll take a look at towards the end of our day when our sketch is over. Okay, so now we build up the language of this. So here are the little side boxes I just talked about that come out, the three we see. And on top of those are little half-arched bastions, which kind of finalize the massing for the church proper. And then on all four sides, there must be, because this, as the weight comes up, when you're on grade and you lift a brick up so far above grade, it has a certain amount of force. If you take that same brick up here, that distance now makes that force much more powerful. So imagine taking the weight of this enormous dome. The way to responsibly resist that is to triangulate it and say whatever the weight is up here, X, if you look at, for instance, the Egyptian pyramids, if you put architecture within the form of a dome and then a mass and then a dome supporting it here and a mass on this side, you can see how even though it looks like it's generated around this idea of a circular space, it really is pyramidal in all directions here, a four-tiered pyramidal, which creates that support for that dome up above. So we'll come down with this first dome here, and that one will rise up from its base to support that one in the front, and then come down to a square feature, which goes back to that same right vanishing point. And then from our vanishing point, it actually projects a bit beyond this, so we'll now release the model and go more from the photograph, and now there's a series of verticals that drop down from that. As it comes down to its next tier, there's a series of fortified bastions that come out towards the corners now in diagonal, and they support that thrust that's coming out. So those will project out on the side and then drop down. And we'll come over to this farthest minaret over here. And then to help support our sketch, we've got so much mass that's built up in the language of this, the heavy stone that's lifted off the crust of the earth, and so much weight's pressuring it down. We're going to use the mass of nature around the building to help support that with value. So if you look in the photograph, sort of stitched in between the architecture and creeping up on the base of the hill, and now at the bottom of the hill over here on the left, and our front here, we've got a natural outlay of vegetation. We simply want to have a shape and a space that we're going to hold on to as we build out the bit of the village part of the city adjacent to Hagia Sophia. There's one little dark pine in the front, a little gradation right up here at the base, and it's truncated by the edge of the photograph, and that's where our sketch will stop too. So in keeping with the idea of the sketch being three-dimensional, we want to not only just draw the object as three-dimensional, but we want to have the human eye think about the landscape around it and how we move through space visually. And typically what happens in our sight path is we see things that are immediately close to us, the foreground. The middle ground is the structure, our subject, and the background is the sky. And the sky is a plane that goes horizontally back well to the distance and eventually comes down. If you could see the distance, it comes down and touches the horizon line. So the built-up aspect on the Bosporus here will prevent us seeing that, but we're still going to drop in a sky that's going to look horizontal going back in space here. So we want to go up to the building and see beyond it in distance, which helps the sketch create that illusion of being three-dimensional and on two. Okay, so now we're going to do this aspect as we've sort of set up the horizon line. We've got the vanishing points. In this case, they're established. We don't really see them unless you put another sheet of paper out here that you can draw down specifically to that point. But in this case, we're going to work with value now to help this thing read initially so we can assign where the sun is coming from and what's dominant. So we're going to follow the image here where on this point, maybe the setting sun here is lighting up this side of it more than the side we're looking at, and definitely is a shade side over here. So we've got three values we're going to march across here, leaving the brightest part white for now, because that's what's going to call attention to us to create form if you leave some of the building, even though it's never really white, the sun can bleach it out to appear white in terms of a black and white sketch. So if it doesn't face this way and it turns the corner towards the other point, we can now come on the side of the pencil and begin to gradate really quickly and loosely, like in a sketch format again, these sides of all the masses. And once you start to push the pencil and does that a bit, it's going to change from being a point to an oblong shape on the tip. So you just keep pushing that along so that this aspect up here at the base of the dome over here, right there, we draw that dark. This is fully on the back side of the space. That dark. You can see that wrapping around here, it's darkest there and becomes lighter, lighter, lighter than brightest on this side. So we're going to start with very light over here and just keep pushing it down so eventually this is the darkest on this side of the dome up above. And we'll do the same for the skin of the dome up top, where instead of saying this side is just dark, we're going to have to do something that's a little more oblong, because when the sun comes down and strikes the dome, it's not just lineal because it's going in 3 dimensions back in depth. So it really arcs in more of a hyperbolic paraboloid in terms of the brightness when the sun hits that. So if the sun comes down and hits right there, that's the brightest point behind that tower. So everything around that gets bleached out, and then that spot kind of curls over and makes kind of a hyperbolic paraboloid shape where it's darker everywhere except for where it hits that light. So we'll start here, and now it looks like there's a hot spot on that, and so the sun is coming down and moving over a space. And once we hit the first layer and zone there, we can then come over and make it deeper on the right side, because the least amount of light is over here on the opposite side of that dome. Again, get at the idea that we want to see the idea of it pushing around here. We want to make sure we spin the dome at the top as well, and we can do that with value. So right now that value is just a placeholder, but it starts to assign where we're going to head towards the latter part of the sketch in about 20 minutes. Okay, same is true with little dome here. It'll be brightest right about here, so we'll do the same kind of oblong shape and tone that over there for a placeholder. This side of the box of the dome is grayed out compared to the one receiving the bright light here in the west towards sunset. Then over to here on that side. And as we trail down, our subject is not the housing. We just need the idea of a housing stock of various sides over the generations here. It's probably from, I would imagine, 17th, 18th, up to the 20th, 21st century that's built up and reborn all the time around the base. So we don't want to make that really something you want to look at in a lot of detail. We're just going to sketch in the rooftops for it that run up to the base of the building, and then drop in some of those values for the walls that don't receive direct light. And that way, this is just sort of the framework for setting up the height of Hagia Sophia above the village that's adjacent to it. So we'll come now to back to our vegetation, which we assign sort of the shape form on the 2-dimensional plane. We're going to start to pull that out as 3-dimensional by giving it a nice strong value adjacent to the architecture. And typically the vegetation itself will always be deeper in tone than the mass of architecture. So we can pull that over here and kind of eliminate our first sketch of that pyramid sort of structural paradigm. And drops down some dark values and some horizontals to have the city proceed over there adjacent. And that kind of comes up to the base. Here's our lone tree in the foreground. There's a little more vegetation just beyond it. And now we have the strongest kind of closest part of the sketch in the architecture of the trees themselves that's near us. That's going to be in the foreground. So we're going to wash that whole thing out. And we return to all this because, in a sense, we sketched it in line, now we're sketching it in value. And we'll take that right down to the base here. We could even break our horizon line a little bit if we like. And then quietly run off the page. There's no need to take value right to the edge because the 3-dimensional sketch is going to have this illusion of being 3-dimensional. If we take the 3 dimension and run it right to the edge of the page, it goes abruptly right back to 2 dimensions and you lost that quality. So it's good to have the value dissipate out into the paper and have it soften as we get away there. So I always have a series of these pencils sharpened because I don't want to have to sharpen them during a sketch. So I have a stock of about 12 per sketch. Keep the point tight because I have to come back now to these minarets and do the opposite side for those, and so I need a little more sharpened pencil to get to the right edge of those. And then where the prayer of song is actually on the perch up here, to actually cast a little bit of shadow. And do that for all 3 that we see on this side. The right side becomes darker. And then same is true for the conical roof for all 4 of them. And if your pencils aren't sharpened for all the detail you want to do at this point, it's worth your while to stop and then sharpen them up to make sure you've got the range of ability with the points of your pencils. So now after about 20 minutes, we've got a 20-minute sketch without a whole lot of detail showing the nuances of the dome we'll get to in a second, or some of the details of the parapets themselves and the minarets, or whatever we're going to work with and build up in the next half hour. We'll just keep bringing this out. But if, for instance, we said, okay, all we have time for is a 20-minute sketch, it's complete for 20 minutes. And that's your goal when you sketch, is that you're always moving across the whole drawing at once with your idea of bringing the 3-dimensional quality out so that you can bring the whole sketch out minute by minute. So whenever you stop, it's done exactly for that amount of time. You're not trying to do a drawing where you're working on the detail of a tree here, which commits to a 4-hour drawing across the whole scope of the piece of paper. So stay in control by doing the drawing over and over again. So now our next method here is to come back in and give more of that architectural detail. And so that's what we're going to do by doing sort of the fenestration. So it seems counterintuitive, but your light source, which seems like be a bright shape, would be most important to leave white. But in fact, in daylight, when you look inside of a building, the glass itself will seem like it's one of the darkest darks in the building. Just like it shows up in the photograph, how dark that is compared to stone adjacent to it. So we're going to simply do a couple strokes vertically for those as they march around. And as they come here, the space between them will be bigger because now it's the closest part of the cylinder to us. And on this side, it'll start to pinch in, and the space between those will get tightened up. And that again helps to kind of have that spinning quality as it moves around us. We'll drop down to the drum just beneath it, the drum of the half dome, and do that skin of perforations in that elevation. There's another tier just beneath that. It has 4 in a row of fenestration for that mass. And then from there on, we drop down into sort of the landscape of the built environment, which is probably mostly housing. And so we can fenestrate that just by doing a simple ribbon of lines that might be kind of an abstraction of what the whole thing is about. But you can certainly put them in. And so that'll read as if it's, again, human scale. Because if this person comes up here, the size of that person compared to a house probably drops to about that big. And so that would be a 2-story building adjacent to it. And we'll just blur those into the foreground. And it's just a setup. You can change the heights of some of the windows. And again, we won't take the information too far to the right. When we come over here, we kind of run into the little forested area. There's a little bit of the town that perks up above this at the base of this side of Hagia Sophia. And now we'll come from the top bottom and we'll work with some of the architectural definition in terms of line work. Okay, so our next step now is to, because our allowance for time is the full 60 minutes, and so being close to halfway done here, we can establish more identity of the actual facts of the building itself. And so we'll come to the crown of the dome, and it's not sort of a skin that's uniform all the way across. It's got a ribbing system like most domes do. In this case, the ribbing for the Pantheon is a stacked tier to it. What's a bit more typical in most domes globally, like we see in the Hagia Sophia, there's ribs come down. And so those structural ribs also are the structural entity, and all the interstitial material then is more lightweight. So the structure's being held more like in a vine-like system, a linear system rather than the whole skin itself. So we want to show a little bit of that because it will catch light. We don't have to show all of it, but we want to anchor it from the middle and then arc it down to one of the windows. And that changes, so each one's individually different. This one's straight up and down in front of us, then it bows the other way. This one's going to come over here to there, and eventually becomes flatter and flatter because it's elongating and reaching these other windows to this side. Now, because this is all in shade over here, that's probably enough for the dome. We don't have to do the shade side because it kind of eclipses the view of that. Then we do the same thing for this half dome, where this is the center, and it'll curl down to this point, here, here, there, 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 there. And it kind of gives some definition of what's actually happening in the actual detail of the building. We'll give some arch to make sure these windows have got the curvilinear top to them. And so this is just sort of definition that's going to help give the reality to it as we just sort of look around the shape of things. The top of all these are crenellated, sort of more of a medieval fashion, or the Song of Prayer, sung daily. On the edge of that, and that comes down again to casting a shadow on that. And that shadow will have a little bit of an arc because it comes down the least amount on the west side, and it comes down the darker eastern side of the minaret. And so we get an arc with that shadow cast. And that'll help create that form in three-dimensional space. And now we're going to do the same thing with the drum of the dome. So a dome has got the actual structure of the dome itself, and then the ring that goes around that, which a lot of times has steel in it to kind of tighten up and make that taut. That's referred to as the drum. The drum here also is going to have light on this side where it's cast shadow, and that'll drop down. And as it comes over here, it's going to start to cast a shadow on itself, and that'll arc down and eventually have that kind of elliptical turn back to the front. And so from here on back, it's actually a much darker view of the stone. So we create the movement of light on our space of the building as we move along here, again, to enhance the idea of the three-dimensional quality. Now with value, the top, the minarets, there's a different type of tone, so we can simply color those in. So they'll puncture the sky for us. And then you can see, too, that there's different designs in the formation of the minarets. So when these were built, they've got more of a striation that's visible. So you can stroke those really quickly with lines on the right side and the one up front here. That gives us some texture. And now it's time to address this big plane in the backdrop. And you have all the ability in the world to change the sky and do what you like, because it doesn't have to be exactly what the photograph does. So we're going to add some quality of clouds to the clearness of the rest of the sky to, again, enhance the idea of depth. So the idea now is that if it was just the blue, and you can sense it a little bit in this photograph, the intensity of the ink here that is printed out is a little bit darker at the top and a little bit lighter at the base, because here we're seeing all the Earth's atmosphere before we get to the color of the sky, whereas above us we see the least amount of atmosphere. So typically the darkest blue is right above you in space. So if that's the case, we need to do a tone that will move from the foreground all the way to the background. And we're going to do that with a series of lines first. They'll show cloud movement. So let's imagine that's the bottom of a cloud movement, which is a little bit irregular to the perspective because it could be coming at an angle. And let's say the height of the cloud is about here. Run that by it. So that's going to be white. It's going to be blue behind it. That same cloud, another mile away, will create sky and only be that deep. So that's the same cloud formation, just repeated in nature, but it's so far away from us now, then the third cloud in the distance is almost 2 lines touching as it passes away. And so we start to build that by now. If we take this cloud and put it above it, it'll be this tall, almost staying above us and holding this whole space together. And then finally, the one that's all the way on top is way up here. And now it seems like rather than having a sheet of tone that's up and down here, it seems like there's a blanket that's moving, that's about to settle down on the building itself at night. So that's going to help us out when we come in and say, in between our cloud formations is the tone of the sky. So we're going to wash between those on the side of our pencil. And then we push through and make sure that connects to the aspect we have on the other side. And we'll come up here and do it again. And so very simply, in a couple of minutes, you've done miles and miles and miles of clouds and sky. And what that does, it helps us then, if something's going to be white and bright here, we're going to push the dark blue of the sky adjacent to it to make that corner where we see the edge of the building and hold space beyond it to be very strong and bold. So that's the strength of our patterning of now. What we draw is important instead of just mimicking exactly what's there, because you only got a limited amount of time. You want to make selections along the way. So obviously, probably this part of the drawing, that third is the most important. We're going to enhance because this replicates the idea over there. So detail the one that's close and then let the detail fall off to the sides here. Okay, so now in a sense, if you keep doing this, we've been moving from 0% of the paper, adding 20, 30. We've got a little bit of 50, 60% in there. We need to move closer to black now. So our next status here is to assign value to the form that holds volume behind it. So if you look at this again, and you're looking at, for instance, one of these minarets in space, the lines that are in front, you can draw those as lines, but they're not really important volumetric lines because I can't get the pencil behind that line. I can't hide the pencil because it's just in the front of another object. And yet the edge line that's over here, I can pass the pencil behind it because it's creating volume and space. So this line is much more important than any line on the body of the building. So we're going to make those outside lines stronger as a point of reference. Not really 100% black or 90%, maybe 80% in terms of pencil pressure. The edge of the dome is outside. It comes along here to the base piece that supports it. The top of these little half circle pieces at the edge of the building, down, and then finally the edge of Hagia Sophia over there. This minaret is in front of Hagia Sophia, so that's got to have strong edges to it. This dome is attached to it, so it really doesn't have much mass to it except for this corner here which projects out, because this circle sits on a square base, so that gets sort of enhanced in our movement here. The top of the church coming down to the right side, the arc coming down and again. And now the top of the trees as well, as they touch the sky, are nice break points for value, and we'll build up the value of the trees as we enhance the sketch moving forward. So wherever we get to the top, just some jagged lines that show branches and trees and leaves and vegetation, kind of outgrowth of the conifers and deciduous trees. They cut in a nice silhouette in the sky. Comes down. So now we've assigned our value to define more of the actual space that's inside of our structure. Okay, the next step then is to eliminate the idea of the black lines being there, because if you squint here and you can barely see the image of the photograph, you never see lines. You see tones and value and grays inside the thing, and they all assemble the idea of that actually having a black line next to a white light. It isn't, it's just a plane of tone. So if we assign a value of something dark here, we want to then push the sky. The same blue we had before is going to appear darker next to the white building. So here we come, and we're going to drill that gray from 20% to 50 or 60% by the time it kisses the edge of the building over here. Same is true on this side. These are going to go a little bit darker right when they hit that black line. So all of a sudden now the black line's there, but it kind of disappears there because the sky makes the line now, rather than just me drawing the line. Same is true over here. We'll make it darker over here. We'll hold that white, which is getting western light, and we'll continue with the light coming from that side to make the sky appear darker. And that's the promise of sketching, is that we're trying to create that illusion of value having more dominance, even though it's all equal on the white of the paper. So we'll continue with that with the edges here. And now to run up to the minarets themselves, the way they'll poke through that, we're going to come to the lower part of the sky when it hits the clouds, which will make that darker, and that'll face where the minaret's actually puncturing the heavens above. Same is true for these. We'll give it a little more sustenance to the base of the open sky above. And it's really your choice. If you find that the sky is still too much of a cartoon version of it, you can wash through that and you can make more forms of value at the base, because sometimes clouds have got a shade side to the cloud and a brightness to the cloud. So you can kind of break that down too as we kind of build into this. So that's the underside of the cloud. The sky's darker right there and runs through that. And so that helps it be a little more poignant in terms of having the relationship between Hagia Sophia and the heavens above. As the songs go out to the people and the light of the gods comes down, and we have this system of relationship between the earth and the heavens. Okay, now as you keep moving forward, we're going to work into some of the foreground detail, because now I think we've established we've got a nice start of having this being a bold sample of the dome proper, and that's why you're here on this site. And the backdrop is starting to help the dome read. Now we want to make sure that this is provocative here as being in the foreground. So all the vegetation here actually has a lot of the great dark values, which are going to set up our whites right here. So typically what happens, instead of making this a subject, we don't want to make sure that this type of deciduous tree is developed as much as the building, but we're going to give some shape to this one in the foreground, the outside edge of it, and then around it we're going to make darker values that are in between the trees. So as the light comes here, this tree may very well even cast a shadow on a tree adjacent to it. And then we may have an excuse down here to kind of put some structural support for the tree trunks. So we see the underside of some of the branches, and we build out that language of just an array of lights and darks and grays coming together here. We'll do the same for the height of this over here. This would be the brighter side facing true west. As you move over this side, the branches get darker, then maybe another tree is struck with light. And so we build out the relationship of lights and darks within this overall value, because on first blush, it seems like it's one gray tone. But actually there's a series of probably 40, 50, and 60% that are all in that foreground there. And now we push that edge right up to the base of the well-lit stone, and it'll create a distance between the foreground and the background. The sharper this gets, the further that goes in the back, but our eye jumps in the space from here to there and makes that nice connection of value. So the same is true with some of the roofs for some of these foreground housing units, are darker tones in the walls that are being lit up. And then some of the actual massing then are on the shade side of the building. So what was white before, the right side of many of these could go dark. Just again to create a symbol of city at the base. And they keep coming all the way down to a flat canopy here in the foreground. So we can put even more here closer up as we kind of infill that residential district. Okay, we're coming down to the last run here, the last push to kind of amplify all this. Before we get that too far, we're going to see the impact that as we move through time, the language of architecture a lot of times is repetitive, because once something's established that there's a great colossal dome in Western culture, then there's sort of an equal type of response to that somewhere else. Once something's established, like for instance this being initially a Christian church, now redefined with the imagery of it on the skin of it and the addition of the minarets, it becomes a Muslim mosque to it. Then this prototype is so dominant in Muslim culture that future buildings, for instance in the 1600s, at the Blue Mosque in just off the Bosphorus as well in Istanbul, almost looks like the Hagia Sophia, only modernized. So built in less time, as they took the symbol of the formwork of the Christian architecture and adopted that and became manifest then in the building of the Blue Mosque later on in the same city. And then that idea then is exported to other religious sites in the Muslim faith. And I have two examples I brought in model form here. Here's one in Africa, and you can see the central dome with a square space with the 4 minarets and the commanding one on the axis there. And then this got printed fairly large, but this is a Russian church, Muslim faith, that also has the same type of system of circles and squares, and yet this is more elongated and vertical. It's actually the smallest scale of the buildings we're looking at here, but it was printed larger. But the paradigm of the geometry never changes, because all faiths, regardless of what they're after in terms of the language of their ideas, are still sharing the same physical qualities of geometry, which it knows no borders. Math knows no borders. And so these systems and devices that are shared between cultures. So if you look at the village of 100 people that represents the 9 billion people on the planet right now, X number are Christian, X number are Muslim, X number are Jewish, X number are Protestants or Catholics, whatever. You can go on a site and break that down. Regardless of that, uniformly, the mathematics says you all can work with circles and squares and triangles, but there's limits to those in terms of the physical presence of how they're going to perform. And so when we draw across cultures at UNESCO sites, we see time and again the same type of geometrical play being played across cultures, even though the religions might be resistive to each other. The language of the architecture is very sympathetic. Okay, so our final push here now is to get to 100% in key areas. And that'll give us a relationship of how we see something that's two-dimensional prepare us to look at something that's three-dimensional as a form. So we're going to assign sort of a left to right value, maybe the top left here, which is more important, and we're going to bring ourselves to 89% black. So prepare to really draw into that volume to see what's going to be the excess of your pencil stock on the paper. So right now, this key point of where we turn from white to stone, the shade stone, the lit stone to the shade stone, makes us, initially, we simply said, well, let's assign a gray to that. The way we see that corner is that the gray itself is the same across the whole space, and yet it appears darker right when it hits the white. So all those zones in the building now, we're going to gradate. So it's not enough to say, oh, I know that's brick, I know it's on the same side, so I get the exact same tone. That's correct. That's scientifically correct at the same tone, but our eye perceives it as being gradated. So we're going to come to the edge of this, and we're going to go stronger right here and gradate 60 or 70% dark, and that fade that away till neutral. And then when the second one pops up in light, it becomes darker again adjacent to that one. So we move the gray across that skin to modulate it and undulate it and have it have sort of a promise to us in terms of how it's perceived. Same is true here. That key edge is darker. When it comes here, it starts dark. Actually, the side of that's dark too. Side of that. And then flushes away, so it becomes more of a neutral gray, and then hits the white skin of Hagia Sophia's drum itself. And so that has to go with a little cast shadow there. And now we'll have this white against that gray. So we're going to go to the top of that. And so we're simply going to push our value towards the whites. So our goal here is to use the dark to celebrate the white. By and large, when you sketch, you're given the white. So you have to eradicate that and only have key points that, because that's where your eye is going to go. And so if you can say there's black and the eye wants to go to light because your eye is a muscle and it wants to open and close and relax itself, then the more you can do that to modulate that across the sketch, the more attraction it'll have to the human eye. So same is true over here. We've got the base of this piece, which is going to run across to the base and hit that corner. Be stronger by the white. This is lit. There's a little bit of a chamfered buttress there that supports. Come over. We'll enhance this side of it, going darker still to that side. And the light of this next to a darker sky will hold that corner for us. This is a grayed out area. It's fairly dark. We've made the sky dark, so we're going to leave that a little bit lighter. Push over to here. Then as it comes down toward the farthest minaret on the right, we'll simply drop the sky down a bit adjacent to it, and we'll give some shape to this tree at the base of that minaret and say that this is the light side of that vegetation and this is the dark side. Infill some of the secondary structure around there. Some more vegetation. We'll push the sky to the base to make sure this looks as bright as possible, piercing through that sky. Could probably create a little bit of a tone there in that cloud. The darker this gets, the brighter that gets and comes towards us. I'll push this gray up against that minaret as well. And now at the end, the very finite part is to get the sharpest pencil you have left and come in and really articulate the strength of some of the lines and a little bit of the presence of the profile of architecture. And the profile is based on the human figure in most every culture and religion, where we've got in profile the visions of a human being, we've got a forehead which is designed with its eyebrow to protect sight. So then there's a recession for the sight line of the eye, and then it comes out toward your nose, which then protects the air movement moving into your body for aspiration, and then to the movement of your mouth to have voice and a more breathing pattern, and finally the chin then is protecting the throat beneath, which delivers all the essentials to the body. So that is the profile of the human being. Architecture has the same profile to it. So you simply find yourself going from the top to the edge there, and then seeing what the architecture is doing in detail and showing a little bit more attention to movement, almost in little architectural scribbles to give a profile to that edge. And tighten up at the top. So every time there's a change of space or plane, there probably is an attention to detail there in material. Come all the way around it and show that definition. We can come inside the windows now because we did as a dark before. Now we're going to put the absolute dark. We'll see a little sliver on these because they're the furthest away, so one skinny line, but the ones are more frontal to us. Part of that box has to go jet black because that's the darkest part in the sketch. And that'll be an attraction to the eye too, to see that black there. We can probably come to the edge of this and define that more. So in a sense, what we're doing is simply tightening up the sketch as time allows. Down. Then we can band the windows up with their structure support, which is provocative on either side of it. These little things then project up on top on the dome. And then to make this dome be resolute like it is over here, we'll push the darkness of the front face of our box adjacent to the white. So that's lit strongly. We've got a little band of windows over here that so now we're closing in on the language here. If we can tilt this up and see our vantage point from what is drawn. Right about there. If I tilt that right for the camera's view. And so the way the points would change then, because this is actually frozen in time, so you can find the points based on the projection of the image. If, for instance, you walk to it and for some reason you are much closer and you're drawing it from here, what happens is your horizon hasn't changed, literally where your eyes are. What has changed are the points. The points may move further out. They move both to the right or both to the left. What happens when you move the points, you're shifting and moving the model around. So imagine this system of horizon line, vanishing point, and value just being an idea of having sort of a human software here. And that's the goal we're after here, is that humans, we need to keep drawing because it's great exercise, right and left brain. It energizes you. You should be a little bit fatigued now with this, but it should be a way to keep your brain supple and fight the aging process by being able to work through drawings like this for your own skill set and feel that reward of having pen to paper. Because as an animal on earth, we were made to draw. We had drawing experiences thousands of years before we had speech. Thanks for joining today. Looking forward to the next time we draw along on UNESCO World Heritage Sites.